Within the world of comic book media, a way that publishers have been able to get away with telling unique stories using their most popular characters without having to worry about sticking strictly to continuity is by having an expanded multiverse. Basically just a collection of parallel universes where things are different, yet similar enough for things to feel familiar to readers and fans. And the two major comic publishers, Marvel and DC, have their own versions of the multiverse and their own rules for how the multiverses function. So in the name of exploration and satiating our curiosity, let's take a look at the differences between the two, as well as how they might handle things in the same way. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. Before we get too deep into the specifics of each of the comic publishers' respective multiverses and how they work, I think it is important that we talk a bit about what exactly a multiverse is. This is going to be a lot of generalities and real-world info for a bit. So if you want to skip that, just go ahead and jump to the next chapter if you're on YouTube, or go to this timecode if you're watching it anywhere else. Although you might want to stick around through this anyways, because it will help you sound smarter when you're talking about multiverses with your friends later on after Multiverse of Madness comes out. Come on, you know it's gonna happen, and who doesn't like looking smarter than everybody else? I know I certainly like it. The idea of the multiverse is not a new creation by any means. It wasn't something devised by comic companies to help them tell stories. Heck, it wasn't even something originally proposed for the sake of storytelling at all. In fact, the idea of infinite realities all existing simultaneously was initially thought up by Greek philosophers way back in ancient times. People such as Chrysippus of Soli proposed that the world was constantly going through a cycle of ending and beginning anew, with each different existence being similar yet distinct from the last. This multiple worlds theory was further expanded and built upon by plenty of other people as the years went on, with a slew of different philosophers, physicists, and mathematicians, each adding their own takes to it. One that you've no doubt heard about is Erwin Schrödinger with his Schrödinger's cat discussion. Didn't think we were going to be talking about quantum physics in a CBR video, and yet here we are. Basically, this thought experiment posits that if you put a cat in a box with some poison, at any point that cat could be either alive or dead, with both being valid states of being. It's only when you look in the box and observe the cat that both states collide together and create one true state of existence. That is grossly oversimplifying a very complicated idea, but you get the basic gist of what I'm saying there. It is something that is just way beyond my comprehension, with a bunch of math symbols that look like this and this that hurt my brain if I even try to think about it. Seriously, what the heck even is that? I think it's a Greek letter, but beyond that, I don't have any idea. I mean, heck, I almost failed pre-algebra. You think I'm gonna be able to do this? In a nutshell, all that you really need to know is that a multiverse is multiple versions of a similar universe, all existing at roughly the same point in time. Each one has their own matter, antimatter, timelines, and sometimes even their own distinct laws of physics. And while they are definitely used as a narrative tool within comics or other forms of media, there is actual scientific evidence that backs up the concept. There's also a bunch of evidence that potentially disproves the existence of actual multiverses and parallel worlds and all that kind of thing, but we don't really care about that because we're here to talk about comic books. That being said, if you do care, there are a ton of awesome articles that have been written about the subject that you should totally check out. Maybe I'll post a few of them down in the comments if I remember to do that. Now that we've got all that nerd crap out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at our first comic publisher, which in this case will be Marvel. I'm going to talk about Marvel here first for a couple of reasons. First and foremost is the fact that with the multiverse becoming more and more of a factor within the MCU, more and more people are generally aware of it, which will make it easier to go over. And second, you kind of need to understand how Marvel does things for me to be able to show you how DC does them differently. Of the two major publishers, Marvel's multiverse is by far the most simple. Each different world is largely its own thing, with not really any complex rules dictating any sort of connections between them. Well, kind of. Each world does have a few specific things that are meant to be shared amongst all of them. Each universe, for example, has its own Sorcerer Supreme, serving as a defender of that specific instance of existence. Each one has its own Captain Britain, a hero set to defend each version of the UK, because apparently that's really important. And there are also the different animal totems, such as the spider totems, meaning that each world has a Spider-Man or what have you. And there is also the cosmic hierarchy that each universe sticks to pretty solidly, that basically lays out the general power levels of cosmic beings, with groups such as the Living Tribunal sitting at the very top, and things working their way down all the way through Eternity, Infinity, Galactus, the Celestials, all the way to the gods such as Odin and Zeus. Beyond all that, the Marvel Multiverse is really quite simple. In fact, more often than not, these parallel worlds more resemble different timelines than they do any sort of different realities, with all of the changes between them really just coming down to how certain events played out. And that makes a lot of sense, honestly, as a lot of what we know as the multiverse today came about because of the old What If comic series that ran from 1977 through 2011. Those comics largely did exactly what you would expect based on the name, taking something that you know and spinning it in a small way to see what might have happened if this or that took place instead. It's exactly what the show on Disney Plus was built around, so easy enough to comprehend if you've seen that. Because a lot of the different realities are more or less just alternate timelines, time travel and multiverse travel tend to be used interchangeably within Marvel Comics. That's why, within the MCU, the rules of time travel are so steadfast, so rock solid. You change something, it'll create a branching timeline. It'll create its own different reality. That's why the Time Variance Authority should be the Multiverse Variance Authority, because Marvel timelines and universes are often the same thing. Now, something that Marvel does have that is different from most cookie-cutter multiverses are all of the different pocket dimensions that exist. We've seen a few of these already, like the ones the sorcerers conjure in Doctor Strange. But there are other bigger and more noteworthy ones as well. There are places like the Dark Dimension, which is a sort of subset of reality that is ruled over by a powerful entity, in this case Dormammu. There are also places like Limbo, the Negative Zone, Soul World. All of these are technically their own realities, but don't fall into the same sort of rule set as normal, larger universes, almost always falling outside of the main multiversal structure entirely. That's all well and good, but in my haste to explain how Marvel's multiverse works, I kinda skipped over something. How was it created in the first place? Sort of important to know that. Well, within the comics it goes something like this. In the beginning there was only one universe, only one reality. However, that didn't last too long, as a war between the Aspirants and the Celestials caused it to shatter into countless pieces. And from those fragments, the first new realities were created, thus forming the first multiverse. Over the eons, many such events took place, which saw the destruction of the multiverse and its subsequent rebirth. This wound up happening enough that the version of the cosmos that we see in the comics today is actually the 7th version of the multiverse. Now here is where time and time travel come back into the picture. As time is a fundamental element of the multiverse, a sort of constant across all of them, that means that time begins and ends with each multiversal cycle. So the quote-unquote dawn of time actually just refers to the beginning of this current version of the multiverse. And the Citadel at the end of time, which we saw Kang hanging out in at the end of Loki, exists near the end of this version of the multiverse. Once the cycle restarts, there will be a new dawn of time, and presumably a new Citadel at the end of time. Probably. So yeah, on the whole, Marvel's multiverse isn't really that complicated, which is good, because it'll make understanding what the heck is going on with DC a little bit easier to swallow, as DC's multiverse isn't nearly as cut and dry. The DC multiverse differs quite a bit from the Marvel multiverse, in some rather large and glaring ways. The most notable of all of them, and the one that you'll often see people pointing to, is the fact that there is a limited number of realities within DC's multiverse, whereas within Marvel, it's literally infinite. Also, there's the fact that all of DC's worlds occupy the same physical space. They're just vibrating at different frequencies, which causes them to not be able to see or interact with each other, which is just sort of wild to think about. It also explains how the Flash is able to seemingly so easily travel between them. because he can just kind of, start shaking at different speeds and then bam, he's somewhere else. But regardless of that, let's go ahead and focus on that first thing. In the very beginning, the multiverse was a much more vast place. Created as a result of some interference by Krona, a godlike being often associated with the Guardians of the Universe and the Green Lantern Corps. It was originally something very similar to Marvel's multiverse, with an infinite number of worlds spread out, each doing their own thing. Then the Crisis on Infinite Earths took place. This multiversal catastrophe saw the destruction of the entire multiverse, with all matter from across those realities being combined together into one sole version of the universe, known as New Earth. However, this lone universe was unstable, as all of the matter contained within was trying to rip itself apart. So, in order to try to fix this, a new multiverse was created, made up of 52 individual worlds. Also, side note, try to remember that number. For some weird reason, DC is almost borderline obsessed with 52, so it comes up a lot. Heck, it comes up at least one more time later on in this discussion. After the events of Flashpoint, where Barry Allen traveled back in time and altered history, the 52 realities were changed in numerous ways, forming a new branch of reality known as the New 52, which was really just an excuse for DC to pseudo-reboot the comics, allowing them to bring in new readers without overburdening them with decades upon decades of canon that they'd have to learn. Not a terrible move on paper, but it didn't really work out for them in the end. Then a few years after that, there was the Convergence event, which bridged the gap between the New 52 and all other realities that have ever existed within DC, including some of the non-comic book worlds such as games, movies, shows, and so on, and forced them somewhat together, which meant that all of the previously defunct realities were now back in existence. So the DC multiverse was once again infinite, right? Nope. Well, okay, kind of. The main DC multiverse wasn't, but there's still an infinite number of possible worlds. How does this work, I hear you typing down in the comments? Well, it comes down to the fact that DC doesn't just have one multiverse. They actually are sitting at somewhere around like 4 or 5 or something like that. Each one separate, but in a way still kind of connected. It's a little weird. For example, we've got the pre-Crisis multiverse, which is where all of the stuff before Crisis on Infinite Earths exists. We have Prime Earth, which is where the current comics are, and then we have the Watchmen universe, the games universe, the animated universe, the Arrowverse is its own unique thing. Didn't I say that it gets complicated on the DC side? Because that's what this is. This is overly complicated. Compare that to Marvel, where every story, regardless of what format it is presented to us in, exists within the same multiverse. The Marvel Cinematic Universe shares the same multiverse as the comics, the games, the other movie franchises, the audio dramas, all of it. That's why Marvel leans so heavily into their Earth number designations. Now, DC does use a similar system. They have universes such as Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 66, etc. But they don't treat it with the same kind of reverence that Marvel does. Because for DC, that doesn't matter nearly as much, as the writers and artists over there don't feel that it is necessary to worry about the global continuity nearly as much as the folks over at Marvel are. Fans of DC Comics have shown that they're largely okay with self-contained stories, and aren't really concerned about how it might affect the larger canon of DC Comics overall. They can look at a graphic novel like The Dark Knight Returns or Kingdom Come or whatever, and not worry about how this might affect the timeline of Batman or Superman or whoever is involved. They're basically just happy to be getting a great story. Maybe that's why Warner Brothers figures that they can get away with having the DCEU while also having standalone films such as Joker or the Batman that don't fit in or connect to the other movies they're putting out at the same time, even if it means having multiple concurrent Bruce Waynes or what have you. DC's multiverse only really matters to DC when it's a fundamental part of the story that they are trying to tell, such as during Convergence or the Crisis events. Marvel, on the other hand, has made it a major component of what it means to be a Marvel story in the first place. So that is basically what it comes down to. The main difference between the DC and Marvel multiverses is how much weight each publisher puts behind the importance of it. Not exactly the most exciting answer, I know, but hopefully all of the other information that I put in this video made it entertaining enough for you that you still had a good time. If you didn't, well, I'm sure you'll let me know down in the comments. You always do. Hey there everybody, I'm John Algetz. I made this video and I want to know what you think. In your opinion, which comic company handles the multiverse the best? Be sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, or go ahead and shoot me a response over on Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to CBR for more great videos just like this in the future.